Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the Apparent Voice. Today, I have a wonderful guest I grew up with, and before I bring him on and talk a little bit about him, I just wanted to say that our hearts are crying out. As a Black mother, as a Black woman, as a Black person, my heart is crying out for my people, and I I keep being stuck with what to say and how to say it, and I'm not concerned about how I say it, but it's just a lot to say. And today's show was supposed to be about the history of racism and education, but I invited our guest to come on to talk about that. And I really like to shift a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about education, but shift from education and just talk about racism as a whole and what we're seeing going on across the United States right now and our people. You will notice that there's a Cash App sign that I have under my name. It says Kalia Family Advocate. So Kalia Pringle is a family advocate who works in Minneapolis right now, and she is on the front line helping people. I've known her for a couple of years. She's a quiet force. She didn't ask us to do this, but she's on the National Parent Union platform with us, and she is providing for families, and she's making sure people are safe. She's providing for people who's been burnt out, and just taking care of people. And one way that people like us, if we're not there, can help for all those who are saying what they want to do. If you want to do something, send a little bit of money her way. So that name will stay there, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But first, Jaymon Jordan, thank you, my brother. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So Jaymon and I have known one another for years, and Jaymon is the founder of the Black Scroll Network, and I would really love for you all to just really pay close attention to what he says. I think your Facebook posts, just like our history lesson every single day, every single day. They are, and they're thought provoking, and they make you actually go do research yourself. And so here in Detroit, we had a law that we were hoping to get a lawsuit we were hoping to win about education, and had 6 young people come up and say, Detroit, you have not educated us. Detroit schools have not prepared me for life. And I think it's wrong. And they sued. And that lawsuit was pretty much overturned, right, Jaymon?
Yeah. Yes, originally in 2018, when the lawsuit was filed, it was Gary B. versus Snyder, because the governor at that time was Rick Snyder, and of course the governor was as the executive in charge of the state, is in charge, at least nominally in charge of the school system, because the school system is really mandated by the state. And so it was Gary B. versus Snyder. It went to the district court. The district court dismissed the case, and then they went to a panel of the Sixth Circuit, and you get drawn by random. They draw the judges by random, so 3 judges were drawn, and that 3-judge panel, 2-1, determined or decided in favor of the 7 students, and their right to have at least a basic level of education. Now they sued so they sued for more than that. They sued for a comprehensive level of education. They sued on behalf of the fact that schools are the Detroit public school system is unequal to many other school systems in the city of Detroit, in the state of Michigan. But the Sixth Circuit didn't rule in favor of those other parts. And they didn't rule in favor that the state is mandated to give a quality education, which is another argument that they gave, that the students argued. The Sixth Circuit, the 3-judge panel of the Sixth Circuit ruled that there's a constitutional right to a basic or fundamental foundational level of education. So at the very basic level, the judges stated that the Constitution says you can't really be a citizen and have any knowledge of the Constitution if you don't have at least a basic level of education. So that's what they won. So it was those basic level of winning that they did. But it's highly important because the federal government was finally acknowledging that that people have a right to education, which means the state and the federal government itself are responsible for making sure that at least a basic level of education was given. And there's never been a decision by a court that that was the case. And that's what they were trying to show. What they also wanted to do was get the governor, the present day governor, because when they initiated this lawsuit, there was a different governor, a Republican governor, Rick Snyder, but now it became Gary B. versus Whitmer once she became the governor. What they wanted to get her to do was to settle the lawsuit rather than appeal it to the full Sixth Circuit or to the Supreme Court. Because the full Sixth Circuit is dominated by conservatives. And of course, the Supreme Court is dominated by Republican nominees to the Supreme Court, which means they're probably hostile to the idea that the federal government and the state governments are responsible for making sure that everybody gets a basic level of at least public school education. So they did not want that to happen. They appealed to Whitmer to settle the case, which she did. She settled the case. She came up with a number of initiatives, including more funding for Detroit Public Schools in order to make the schools even better than probably basic. Her idea was to try to make them really give funds so it could be a quality education in Detroit Public Schools. Of course, we have a Republican legislature, so they disagreed with that, and they were ready to file briefs to the full Sixth Circuit. The Sixth Circuit agreed to hear the whole case, which means that the 3-judge panel's decision is overturned. So at this point, there is no federal government guaranteed responsibility for the federal government or the state government to supply or give or provide a basic level of education. Until the full Sixth Circuit hears the case and the argument goes all over again, we don't know where it's going to go. But it doesn't look good because, again, the full Sixth Circuit is dominated by conservatives, Republican nominated judges, and it would be out of character for them to vote in favor of the Detroit 7. Not saying it can't happen. I'm not saying that it can't happen, but it would be a surprise if it did.
Yeah. But you told a tale, right, on that post of how historically there's been these constant slaps in the face, right? There's been these, here, let's throw you out this rope, grab it, let's pull you right back in, right? You know, there's been this historical loophole that brings you right back to step one. So and a lot of that is correlated with housing. And a lot of people are like, what do you mean education and housing, right? And what do you mean?
So
how does those two, what about that?
So when we think of segregation, many of us think to the South. So we think of Mississippi and Alabama, and we think of Martin Luther King Jr. leading the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama. And we think of the Mississippi Freedom Summer, fighting for the right to vote and organizing people against segregation and Jim Crow in Mississippi, and Emmett Till being murdered in Mississippi. So we think of the South, particularly in the 1950s and 60s when we think of segregation. But Jim Crow or segregation operated all over the country. And it looked a little different in other places besides the South. And one thing in the North that has a much longer history than it does in the South is housing segregation. So housing segregation is a legacy of Northern Jim Crow or Northern racism. And even though people don't talk about it that way, housing segregation is school inequality. They're the same thing. We just call them something different, all right? So let's just talk about Detroit's history, for instance. So there's been a number of cases in Detroit that are important. And so I'm going to start in the 1800s. And in 1867, the Michigan the Michigan legislature passed a law that stated that all publicly funded schools, which we now call public schools, all citizens are able to go to those schools. So if Detroit has public schools, any citizen in Detroit is able to go to those schools. If Pontiac has public schools, any citizen in Pontiac can go to those schools. That's what the state legislature passed in 1867, which meant that what was going on, which was segregated schools, was unconstitutional. The Michigan State Legislature said that is against the Constitution. The Constitution says that if they're citizens, then that means it's a taxpayer-funded school. They're taxpayers, they should be able to go to school. Detroit public schools, which had the highest number of Black folks in it, the city of Detroit, which had the highest population of Black people in the state of Michigan, said that the law doesn't apply to us. We know that's the law, the state made that law, but because we got all these Black people and all these other cities, they don't even have all these Black people. We should have the right to segregate our schools and keep these Black people out of the school, out of our public schools. And so there's a lawsuit, Workman versus Board of Education, 1869, against the Detroit School Board of Education in their practice of continuing segregation, even though the Michigan legislature had passed a law saying there should be no such thing as segregated public schools. And the Michigan Supreme Court hears that case in 1869 and rules in favor of the African-American plaintiff, Joseph Workman. And Detroit Public School opens up their first integrated public school in 1871, Everett Elementary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so African Americans are finally able to go to a public school. What were the colored schools like? So the colored schools that existed prior to this lawsuit were
a hand-me-down
open.
White schools.
Yeah, they were open half a day. They were only open half of a school year, and you could only go to school for 6 years. So no such thing as what we would call middle school or high school for African Americans. And basically it's no books, no paper, no pencil, no desk, no chalk, no chalkboard, nothing that we would think of as school existed in those schools unless some Black folks donated those things to the schools, because the taxpayers' funds did not go to do any of those things in the schools. And so it's an unequal education. And what African Americans are really fighting for, not really fighting for the right to sit next to whites in school, but they're fighting for the right to be in schools that have the resources. And that's the white schools. So they're trying to fight for their children to be able to go to schools that have books, paper, pencils, desks, teachers, chalkboard. That's what they're fighting for. And they know that to get those things, they have to have their children in the same schools as white students. Because if Black children are in the schools by themselves, those resources would never be there. So that's what they're fighting for.
That's one of those things you always hear somebody say, well, my great-granddaddy only had a 6th grade education. Only had a 6th grade. Right. And it's like, it wasn't just that granddaddy got out of school. Granddaddy didn't have a school to go to.
That's right. Wow. That's right. And that was the case in the city of Detroit. And so every elementary opens, but every elementary is in a district, the Lower East Side of the city of Detroit, where there's multiple racial groups and ethnic groups living. Of course, Black people live there, Black Bottom, they live there, but so do Polish immigrants, German immigrants, Greek immigrants. Greektown is right there. Italian immigrants. All of those groups of people live there in that same neighborhood. So that school is integrated because all those people live in the same neighborhood. So they're going to be zoned to go to the same schools. But other parts of the city of Detroit are segregated. Black folks can't live in a whole bunch of the city of Detroit because of housing segregation. And so if they don't live there, they can't go to the schools there. And so the schools are unequal at that time within the same school district. Today, when we talk about school inequality, we're talking about Detroit versus Grosse Pointe.
Yeah.
Or we're talking about Pontiac versus West Bloomfield. Or we're talking about Inkster versus Birmingham. We know the schools are unequal. Predominantly African-American schools in impoverished communities versus predominantly white schools in wealthy communities. The school districts are going to be unequal. The resources in the schools are going to be unequal. The types of courses that are available are going to be unequal. All those things are unequal. But in Detroit, from the 1800s all the way up until the 1970s, we were not really talking about Detroit versus suburbs. We were talking about one school in the city of Detroit where Black people live versus another school in the same city with the same school board in charge of both schools where mostly white people live. So we were talking about Miller versus Mumford. We were talking about Northern versus Redford High. We were talking about Southeastern versus Denby. So this is what we were talking about. So Denby, Mumford, and Redford, those schools were predominantly white all the way up until the 1960s, while Miller and Northern and Southeastern were predominantly African American.
And they like make up almost like that little border right there, black bottom.
That's
right.
Brown,
black bottom, and in
right.
Black bottom.
And so this is the inequality, and it's based on housing. Where you live decides which school you go to. And all the schools that were predominantly white, where Black people weren't allowed to buy homes, mainly because of racial restrictive covenants, inside of the deed itself, it would be written, this home cannot be sold, leased, or rented to a Negro or colored or some other name they used for African Americans at that time. And so whoever bought the house signed that, and when they got ready to sell it, they had to agree to continue following that rule. And so this is the major form of discrimination up until the 1940s, when the federal government gets involved in segregating homes with the FHA, the Federal Housing Act of 1934, and the Federal Housing Act of 1937, where the federal government will only guarantee loans for mortgages if they're in racially homogeneous neighborhoods, which means it has to be segregated. We won't give a mortgage on a home that's in an integrated neighborhood. And so since Black Bottom was integrated at one time, the whites who wanted a home loan had to leave Black Bottom, which is how Black Bottom is going to become all Black. That's how it's going to become all Black, because white folks want a home. And the only way they can get a home is if they leave Black people. So there are neighborhoods that were integrated that become segregated. So Greektown, Greeks move out, and Germans move out, and Polish folks move out, and Black people are left. And so now you have whites moving into all white neighborhoods in the city of Detroit before the suburbs. They're moving to other neighborhoods in the city of Detroit, and Black people are left there. When Black people try to get those FHA-backed loans, the federal government says, no, you can't get it. Because if we give you a home loan to move into that new neighborhood, then it'll be an integrated neighborhood. And we don't give loans in integrated neighborhoods. So Black people say, well, then what about a home in my own neighborhood in Black Bottom, where it's all Black? You know, or the North End, or Coney Gardens, or Old West Side. You know, can I get a home there? And the federal government says, well, we got maps of where we give loans out, and they're color coded. So let's look at your neighborhood. The maps are color coded. If it's green, if your neighborhood is green, then you can get the loan. If it's blue, you're probably going to get approved for the loan. If it's yellow, you might not get that loan. And if it's red, you cannot get the loan. It's where the term
what qualified those? What was that blue, green? What was those colors now?
So one reason, is a lot of reasons that they put in it, but one reason is race. So if it's a predominantly Black neighborhood, then it's going to be a red area. It's where the term redlining comes from. And so it was believed that African Americans, if they're in the same neighborhood, then the housing value goes down. And therefore, we don't want to back mortgages in that area. The reason why housing value went down in Black neighborhoods is not because Black people moved in and they're inherently less capable of taking care of their neighborhoods. The reason why housing value goes down when Black folks moved in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s is because when Black people moved into a neighborhood, whites moved out. And as you have more vacancies in any area, well, then the value is down. Because if 2 or 3 or 4 Black people move onto a block and 5 white families move away, well, you got 5 vacant houses. 5 vacant houses makes that neighborhood, the housing value go down in that neighborhood, because anytime you have wealth or a large a surplus of product, then the value goes down. So if it's a neighborhood that only has one vacant home, well, the prices in that neighborhood are going to be higher than the area that has 8 vacant homes. And the reason it's 8 vacant homes is because the white folks moved away because black people moved in. And so
yeah, you said something about how they assume black people tore up their neighborhoods, right?
right,
Well,
right.
they proved some of the black bottom theory of, oh, it was desolate, it was terrible, black people wasn't taking care of it, when all these photos popped up and they put up the exhibit of black bottom in the library, and you can see beautiful, thriving black bottom as they were taking photos to disseminate the whole community. Right?
Yeah, that's Black Bottom Street View exhibit. I was a consultant to that. Emily Kudo is behind that exhibit, and I was a consultant for that exhibit. But yes, what happens particularly with Black Bottom was built. It was enough housing for about 30,000 people. There were 140,000 people living in Black Bottom about the time that it's destroyed. So it's overcrowded. Why is it overcrowded? Because of housing discrimination. Because black folks don't have no other place to go. So if you can't live on 7 Mile and Evergreen, and you can't live on Wyoming and 6 Mile, if you can't live there, then you're going to be concentrated in the one neighborhood or 2 or 3 neighborhoods that you can live. And those areas are going to be overcrowded. Houses that are built for one family got 3 and 4 families living in them because they don't have nowhere else to go. And so that helps to bring down some of the homes and some of the neighborhoods in Black Bottom. And of course, the city reduces its services in areas that are predominantly African-American. So street cleaning happens less in predominantly African-American communities. It happens more in areas that were still predominantly white. Even now, I do a lot of presentations in suburbs. Even now, when I go out to the suburbs and I talk about how the streets are, it's like, wow, the streets are really, really clean, and all of this. Some of the people in the suburbs will be frank with me and say, we don't do that. The city comes out and cleans that. We don't, if it's
clean up the parks and all that.
We don't do all that. We don't do that. If it was left to us, it might not be as clean. We don't know, but we don't do that. The city comes and do it. We pay taxes, so that gets done. So our city services make sure that our streets are clean, that the stop sign that's hanging down, we can complain, and the next day, that stop sign is fixed.
Right back up.
It goes right back up. And people will say, of course, to impoverished communities like Inkster and Detroit and Pontiac, they'll say, these people don't keep up their own neighborhoods. What they're saying is that you go to work, maybe 2 or 3 jobs, take care of your children, make sure they get to school. And on top of that, you must also clean all the parks, mow the lawn of the vacant house next door.
Vacant house next door.
The thing is, you got to do all of this stuff with no other community has to do that. All right. So housing segregation is school inequality because of zoning. And that first lawsuit, Workman versus Detroit Board of Education, is one of the most important school civil rights lawsuits in the country, but definitely in Michigan. And I say there's 3 very important school and civil rights lawsuits in the state of Michigan, the 3 most important. And Workman versus Board of Education is the first one in 1869. The next one tries to deal with this divide between neighborhood schools. Some neighborhood schools got everything going for it. Other neighborhood schools have students teaching math. So Northern in the 50s and 60s had students teaching some classes because they didn't even have teachers. And the Northern students knew it was wrong. So they organized a walkout, a boycott of the school in April of 1966. And other predominantly African-American schools, basically to support them, did the same. So this is Northern High School. This is the school that
my mother was
Smokey Robinson graduated from there. Right. So this lawsuit happens in 1971, and it's Milliken versus Bradley. Again, the governor is Milliken, Governor William Milliken. The Bradleys, of course, was one of the families. It's more than them, but their name is on the lawsuit. But the Bradleys are a family who are against these segregated schools.
Mhm.
And the way the school district zones the students keeps black students out of, or keeps the majority of black students out of the predominantly white schools. And the school board rezones all the schools so that more black students can get into the so-called good schools. And there's a recall for every one of the school board members that voted in favor of that. They're successfully recalled and pulled out of office. The state legislature passes a law to stop, to put an injunction on this integration plan of the schools. And the NAACP files a lawsuit in support of the parents who want a more equal school district, and it's called Milliken versus Bradley. Milliken versus Bradley wins in district court. Judge Stephen Roth rules in favor of the African-American, and there's also actually a white family in there as well who wanted their child to go to an integrated school. And so what it calls for is a change in the zoning for African-American students, predominantly African-American students in one part of the school district, to go to schools that are predominantly white in the same district, and for busing outside of the district into suburban schools. Of course, the state legislature in Milliken, they appeal it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules against the black students, and basically stating that suburbs have nothing to do with the segregated school systems that exist. And Detroit is surrounded by dozens of suburbs that are all white. The school districts are all or very close to all white, and they are of course unequal, and it takes them out of the equation, which means if you're white and you live in the city of Detroit, all you need to do is move to a suburb and you can ensure that your child does not have to go to school with black kids. The Supreme Court rules that we're not going to enforce integration in the suburban schools. We're only going to fight for civil rights within the same district. And so that is a very important lawsuit because it changes everything and it speeds up white flight throughout the country. So white parents who've had their children in city schools that were in a predominantly white area of that city, whether it was Chicago or Cleveland or Cincinnati, they know that eventually black folks are gonna be able to go to those schools within Cleveland and Cincinnati and Chicago and Detroit. But if they move to a suburb, the Supreme Court has ruled that they don't gotta worry about black students being bused out to that suburb or their students being bused into the city so they can be integrated. And so white flight speeds up and school inequality grows after 1971. And this is a northern lawsuit. This ain't Mississippi. This is not Alabama. That I don't want the people to forget that. Yeah, I don't want the people to forget that the so-called liberal North is the most strident, the most hardcore when it comes to where people live and where people go to school. They do not want integrated neighborhoods and they do not want integrated schools, even much more so than the South. All right, so I just want to make that clear. And so school inequality and housing segregation is the same thing. The reason why the suburbs are predominantly white and have unequal schools, their schools have more resources, is because African Americans were blocked from moving into those suburbs by racial restrictive covenants, which are written into the deed itself. You can't sell this house to a Negro. And then later, again, the federal government, the Federal Housing Act of 1934, the Federal Housing Act of 1937, blocks home loans for working class folks if the neighborhood is racially integrated. So the only way a black person can get a home loan is if they stay in an all black neighborhood and it's not in the red section of the map. Wow. So about 9%
and that not getting home, and that not being able to own the homes in the red areas because they were about to bulldoze the red area.
Yeah, and so that would happen a few years later, but you're right. And so one of the reasons that is a part of the story as well. And so of course, this is going to create a few things. It's going to create housing segregation, which is what it really is designed to do. It also creates school inequality because the schools, the housing value, those property taxes go right into the schools in that community. And so if the houses are worth more and black people can't go there, can't live there, then that means they can't live in the houses that their property tax would afford them to be able to go to those higher resource schools. So schools are unequal. But then the third thing that it does is it creates a wealth gap. Because the number one way to build wealth in this country, the way that most people in the country have built wealth, has not been to be like Henry Ford. You started a company and it really took off and it got big, or you were a great inventor, or you were a great basketball player or actor or dancer. People do get rich that way. That's not how most people. That's not how most people in America get rich. Most people get rich in this country by owning some property.
Yeah.
And the property appreciates in value, and they pass it down to their children and grandchildren.
Children's children, yeah.
That is how most people get rich. And so you had African Americans in the 30s, 40s, and 50s who were both working at Ford Motor Company. Let's just pick Detroit. So they're working at Ford. They're making about the same money income-wise. So they not that far. The income inequality is not big. It's slight.
Yeah.
But one group of people is going to get a home loan, and one group of people is not going to be approved for a home loan. So 20, 30 years later, that Ford white worker who has a home, that home that they bought for $7 or $8 or $9 or $10,000 is now worth $70, $80 or $90,000. It is appreciated in value. So now they have wealth that they can pass on to their children. Or they can,
and some of those same people are still owning the old homes in the red area.
And they're renting them out.
So
That's
the
right.
black people
That's right. They're renting them.
Are poorer, and they
That's
rent
right.
from those white people who are now
African Americans who didn't get a home loan are renting some of the old home from the people who was able to get a new home loan and moved out, or they're renting from the Brewsters.
Yeah.
So the federal government creates the Brewsters with the same housing act that gave white people a home loan. Black people got projects. So black people were able to move into a project and they could pay rent. So what black people have 30 years later is rent receipts from the Brewsters. And what white folks who worked at Ford have later is a home equity. And they have moved up in wealth. And so where you had income equality, now you have wealth inequality. Housing segregation is connected to so much. And it's also connected to what we're dealing with in Louisville and Minneapolis today, which is police brutality. Yeah, police brutality is highly correlated with housing segregation. There are certain communities that experience more police brutality than other communities. And the two main communities that experience the most police brutality are communities that have a police department inside of a municipality that's predominantly African American, or they are on the border of a city that's predominantly African American. So if you're talking about Detroit, it would be Detroit, which is a predominantly black city, and all the suburbs that surround Detroit, Livonia, Warren, Grosse Pointe, East Point, Harper Woods, Redford. These would be the places where African Americans experience the most problems with the police, either the city they're in or the cities that border the city they're in. And so this is going on throughout the country. However, if housing segregation had not been a thing, black people would be proportionally represented in all of these towns, in all of these places, and you'd have a lower level of police brutality.
This morning, one of our coworkers, James Ribron, was sharing with us on the call yesterday. He was riding his bike. So I live 3 blocks from Grosse Pointe, which is our rich community, right? And James lives the same. He lived not far from me, so about 4 or 5 blocks from the Grosse Pointe. Ride his bike through Grosse Pointe. Yesterday, the police stopped him riding his bike. James Ribron just out, riding his bike. You can walk right up there and see people jogging and riding their bikes all day long. Grosse Pointe police decides to stop them.
That's right.
Do you live in Grosse Pointe? Well, no, no, sir. You know what? He's like, oh, well, what are you doing over here? I'm riding my bike.
Right. You can see what I'm doing.
What am I doing? You can see what I'm doing. I got a bike outfit on. The officer told him, yes, well, I'm going to watch you as you ride along, and cruised along with James until James just decided to come on up casual and come back. It was like, yeah, I'm not doing this today. Y'all done
So
took somebody somewhere else.
yeah, the message was clear. You're not wanted. And so I'm going to send a blatant message to you that you're not really wanted here, in hopes that it'll make you leave and get out of our town. And so this was, of course, a overt policy at one point where you had sundown neighborhoods. So in certain parts of the city of Detroit, Black people could work there, but they had to be out by sundown. And then you had sundown towns all around Detroit, where Black people worked in those neighborhoods or in those towns, in those suburbs, but after sundown, they had to be out and they could be arrested. Even when I was growing up, Dearborn was still a sundown town for Black people, even when I was a young child. So in the 1970s, my grandmother made sure that she let us know that you don't go to Dearborn. The mayor, Hubbard, had, and the city council had created a number of policies, including a park policy, where unless you're a Dearborn resident, you can't even go into a Dearborn park. And of course, who are they going to check to find out if you're really a resident or not? Whose ID they going to check?
My first place that I ever experienced racism. Dearborn was. Right. I was at the mall, and I tell people all the time, with my friends, a couple of white girls, right? And me, 2 Black girls and a couple of white girls. Got there, security guard came over and said something to us. We turned around like, yes. You know, he looked at me, he said, oh, so I see they're letting the monkeys back out. J-Mon, I'm like 14, and I'm like, what the heck, man? And my white friend, she's like, why would you say that? And it just behooves me, like, what, that was my first racial experience. And I'm sitting up there like, wow, like I haven't heard about this, but now I'm living it, right?
Right. Yeah, so Detroit was surrounded by those type of towns. And on some level, even though the overt racist kind of overtones are gone, there's still sometimes more subtle ways that you're reminded that you're not welcome in the Grosse Points, in Livonia, Taylor, and many other communities. Sometimes you're reminded that, you're not really wanted. If you're on this road, the main road, well, that's fine. But when you start going into the neighborhoods, the police pull over, hey, what you doing here? Do you live here? So you get a little reminder that you're not wanted. If you're on Woodward or if you're on Jefferson, well, they feel like you're coming and going. But if you go down one of the side streets, you might get a visit like your friend got in Grosse Pointe, where the police say, do you live here? What you doing here? And so we still deal with that. But housing segregation, school inequality, and again, that third lawsuit is the one that we're dealing with now. And so the third school lawsuit that's important in Detroit or Michigan civil rights is Gary B. versus Snyder, which his predecessor was a Highland Park lawsuit. And sometimes people forget that there was a Highland Park lawsuit prior, the year before this. A group of students in Highland Park sued for the right to literacy. They believed that they had a basic right to education, which is really the same argument. The ACLU took the case and argued it in state court. That's the difference. They argued it in state court using the state constitution as the model and the responsibility for the state to provide an adequate education. And the state Supreme Court ruled that the state constitution promotes education, but does not mandate it. And so they dismissed the lawsuit. The group from Detroit went to federal court. Since they saw what happened in state court, they went to federal court and got a more favorable.
Highland Park has no schools.
Right. Yeah, Highland Park had. At the time that the lawsuit started, they had the one high school left and the one.
Our old school.
And it was all the schools were charter schools. There was no traditional public school in Highland Park at the time, and they were arguing that the high school that they had was totally inadequate. It was nowhere near a true education. But the state said, the state Supreme Court said you're right that it's horrible, but the state doesn't have a right, doesn't have a responsibility to give you anything. And so their lawsuit was
and we got quality education in Highland Park.
Yeah,
like for real. We were like up there with Country Day, and we did spelling bees with
it was definitely difference in the time period that we went to school versus the present day. And schools have become more unequal, especially after the 1980s. So since the 1980s, however unequal schools were, and they were unequal even before then, they've become much more unequal since the 1980s because white flight has increased. So whites have poured out of major cities. They created many more predominantly white suburbs with their own school districts, with higher resources, with higher property taxes funding those schools, and they have no responsibility to the schools that are in the inner city. So Detroit is surrounded by 160 some school districts, and none of them have to do anything about Detroit schools. None of them have any responsibility to what's happening to students in Detroit. And so we're still living with school inequality, housing segregation, and northern version of Jim Crow, the northern version of segregation.
Yeah. And so today we have, that was like a big letdown for a lot of us, And when I read your post, it's like knowing all those things in a bubble within themselves. But when I read your post, bringing it all together was like, wow, like just to see the pattern of what you just explained, coming from all the way back from 1860s to now. And we're still fighting for a basic education.
Right.
For our babies, a basic education. That's all we want.
And not a quality one. So of course, again, and the foundation, when Black folks were brought to this country and enslaved, it was illegal in most states and counties to give Black people any education because, of course, giving them an education would make them unfit for slavery. And so it was illegal. We're really dealing with the modern day version of that. So then it was just blatant. It's illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. Today, it's not said that way. It's said that the federal government and state government have no constitutional responsibility to provide an education to.
So you can teach them if you want to, but
right. So it's the modern day version of the same rule.
And I really am afraid that law is not there because with everything happening during the pandemic in education, and we have kids in Detroit, again, who aren't having any interaction with teachers, but in the suburbs, those kids went home day one with technology, Zoom classrooms set up, schedules set up, and it may not be perfect, right? Because it's not perfect for anybody. But in Detroit, we keep hearing, but we're all dealing with this and we need you to,
we're all in this together.
The teachers are, we all in this together. No, we're not all in this together because they're not in this together with us.
That's right. We have students who went to school in the middle of the pandemic to take the advanced placement test. Advanced placement test, of course, is an online test. And if you don't have the technology at home or your technology is not fast enough, your Wi-Fi speed is not fast enough, then you can't take the test at home. They went into schools in the middle of the pandemic. No suburban district did that. But in Detroit, there were students, not all of the students, but a significant number of students had to go into a school. Staff had to go into that school, taking a chance at being infected or infecting someone. All this time we're telling people to stay home, stay safe, but not if you got to take the AP test. You got to go into a school.
And the whole thing is they didn't have to do it because they was already prepared. They already had their kids set up for AP classes for next year. They had a plan already despite the pandemic, right? Our kids are going to be in AP class. Those kids knew probably in December what AP class they were going to be in next year.
Well, see, the AP test, the way it works is you take the AP classes, and then to get the credit, the college credit, you got to take this test. So so these are students who all took the class. They've done well enough in the class to get the credit. and now they got to go in and take a test. Now, of course, it's a whole bunch of stuff that could have been done. AP, the college board could have said, you know what? We're going to dismiss the AP test this year. All the students who got a favorable grade in the AP class, well, you that's enough because of the pandemic. They could have done that. No, they didn't do that. Because they know that the overwhelming majority of students who are AP students live in suburban America, and they have access to whatever technology is necessary for them to do it at home. A group of students who are not the majority of students in AP classes, but their significant group are students in places like Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, East St. Louis, Chicago, places that are impoverished, where you have students who can't afford to have the computer that has the best Wi-Fi and all of that. Yeah. And so some of those ones will have to go into a school. And the organizer of the AP test didn't care about them enough. And I have to say the Detroit Public Schools didn't look out as well as they should have for these students either. And these students went into a school, taking a chance on coming in contact with that virus. And even if they were going to be okay, which is not true, young people do get sick and some have died. But even if they don't, they have a chance of bringing it back to their family members. Yeah. And they had to do that when no student in Grosse Pointe had to do that. In the 5 Grosse Pointes, no student in Birmingham had to do that. No student in Bloomfield had to do that. No student in Farmington, Royal Oak, Rochester had to do that. Schools are unequal. And it's no way to argue that that's okay. We can't say that we expect our children in Detroit to do just as well as everybody else, and we've done and the system has done everything possible to make sure that they don't. So that's the
there's no even playing fields nowhere for our kids. No, it's not. Nowhere. And wow. So I don't know. It's so much more I could say. Oh my God, there's so many questions I have in my head. Oh wow. One thing I want to make sure I say is that there's this long history of backlashes. Every time there's a win on one level, there's this backlash where the victory gets snatched away. And so that happened in 1867 when the Michigan legislature said, hey, we're gonna make schools, everybody can go to whatever school is in their district. Well, the Detroit Public School says, nope, not so fast. And so there was this backlash. And even when they won the lawsuit in 1869, Workman versus Detroit Board of Education, well, because of housing, the school stayed unequal. And then when the school board said, okay, we don't care about where people live, these black students are going to get zoned to go to Mumford and Redford and Denby, all those good schools too. Well, then the Supreme Court said, well, but if they move to the suburbs, you can't do nothing about it. And so every time there's a win, there's a backlash and the victory is snatched away. And so that's what happened here again with Gary B versus Whitmer. These Detroit 7 heroic students fought this heroic fight, backed up by attorneys, activists. 482 Forward. Yep. I mean, we done been to Lansing and everything. We were out there the day we were asking the governor to sign it. We out there honking horns, riding around. Right. You know, all this kind of stuff, people putting fingers up at us and all this kind of stuff. Like, dude,
they fought about your business. They fought a fight just as admirably as the Little Rock Nine in 1957. When they went to Little Rock. So they're heroic students and parents and activists and attorneys that helped win this fight, but then it gets snatched away right after they win, which is really the history of Black progress has always been Black people make progress and then it gets snatched away and they have to fight that same fight over again.
Per the anger we got going on right now, right? Backlash we have going on right now.
That's right.
So not just anger ain't even a sufficient word for it. Like people are tired. People are like, you know, every time we get a step forward. And then I keep hearing people who are saying, and I know we're supposed to be off, but give us just 2 or 3 minutes, y'all. But I know there's people who are saying, well, you know, they arrested the guy. They arrested him. I don't care if they arrested him. This is more than just one arrest, right? This is a systemic issue.
That's right.
That unless we face this as America, this is not going to end well for people. And people are ready to act proof positive of what's going on, right?
That's right.
And then even the fact that everybody that was out there acting wasn't even acting on our behalf. Some of them were sent out there to make it look bad, right? So with that being said, I don't know, this conversation can go on and on. I just feel like nobody's coming to save us, so we got to save ourselves.
That's right. Yeah,
we got to save our babies ourselves. We got to be diligent about it, but strategically diligent about it. I believe,
right.
You know, not a go off just anger, but somebody asked me yesterday in Detroit, are y'all ready to march? Come on my post that I made yesterday. Come on, let's go march. I said, no, I'm not marching. I'm not marching like that. Because just to walk downtown and go march means more black bodies gonna fall in my city, and I don't want that on my head because I know the following we have, right? So you want to orchestrate some stuff, because back in the day when they marched and they sat in diners, they talked about bail money, they talked about phone numbers to call, talked about who you gonna call. They made a plan to do what they were gonna do, and it was well devised.
Yeah, all activism is multifaceted. So yes, there are people marching, and there were people marching in the 50s and 60s, but there were other people doing some other stuff too. Yeah. So none of these things were by themselves. They were in concert with other activities, with lawsuits, with boycotts, with pressure, with lobbying politicians. All these things were going on at the same time. So marching was never one thing all by itself. A rally wasn't all one thing by itself. A sit-in wasn't just a sit-in. There were all these other things going on at the same time, which made it a movement. So when we talk about any kind of activism, it's multifaceted. Even though you see the march, that's a visible portion, there's some other stuff going on too.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jaymon, I would love for you to come back and us talk a little bit further, talk a lot more. And thank you so much, my brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, I look forward. I'll send you an email. We'll check. Everybody, please go to Black Scroll Network at gmail.com and email Jaymon. Jaymon does tours in the city. He's the one who helped consult on the quite a few movies about Detroit and documentaries and stories about Detroit. He's legendary and knows his facts. If you're ever coming to Detroit, take one of his tours. Take a virtual tour with him, you know, if he has it up right now.
I'll be starting virtual tours in June. Yep.
Okay, good. And where else can they find you, Jaymon?
So if you're on Facebook, we have a Facebook page, Black Scroll Network History and Tours. You can also go to our website and request information at our website, blackscrollnetwork.weebly.com. blackscrollnetwork.weebly.com. So you can find us there, and our new tours will be coming up on Eventbrite. So you can go to eventbrite.com/blackscroll, and then you'll see our new virtual tours coming up soon.
Yep. And again, you guys, if you have it, please, if it's $10, if it's $20, if it's $1,000, you want to donate to the families and community in Minneapolis. Kalia Pringle, I would love for you to donate to her. It is $KHULIA Family Advocate on her Cash App, and also on the MPU site, we have another donation for her actual organization. So this has been the Apparent Voice, our Friday show. Forgive us for going over, but thank you for tuning in. And I look forward to talking to you guys next week as we dive more into homeschooling and the options that families are seeking to educate their own children moving forward. Thank you, Jaymon, again.
Thank you. Thank
Blessings
you so much.
to you. Love you. And thank you, guys.
Appreciate it.